Welcome back to another episode of Out Loud Geek, where we discuss news and views about pop culture, science fiction, fantasy, food, cooking, the outdoors, and more. Rotten Tomatoes. Millions of people are very familiar with this review aggregation website for movies and television. Originally launched 25 years ago in August 1998 by 3 undergraduate students at the University of California at Berkeley, for its first 6 years in operation, it was an independently controlled website. But then it was bought by IGN Entertainment in 2004, which was subsequently purchased by News Corp's Fox Interactive Media in 2005. Then IGN sold Rotten Tomatoes to Flixster in January 2010, which was then acquired by Warner Brothers in 2011. In February 2016, Rotten Tomatoes and its parent site Flixster were sold to Comcast's Fandango Media, though Warner Brothers retained a 30% minority stake in the merged entities, including Fandango. Fandango then shut down Flixster's operations in the US in February 2018 and internationally in October of 2019. So, Rotten Tomatoes, which continues to aggregate reviews for movies and television from professional critics as well as audience scores, is owned by a company that sells movie theater tickets, which itself is partially owned by a major Hollywood studio. Does this sound like a recipe for conflicts of interest and a lack of impartiality? That's what many have been saying for years, and guess what? It's true, and now there's verified proof. From an article that was first published by Vulture a few days ago, the headline reads, "The decomposition of Rotten Tomatoes. The most overrated metric in movies is erratic, reductive, and easily hacked, and yet has Hollywood in its grip." Well, for the last part of that title, it may be more accurate to say that Hollywood has Rotten Tomatoes in its grip. In 2018, a movie publicity company called Bunker 15 took on a new project, a movie called Ophelia, which was a feminist retelling of Hamlet starring Daisy Ridley. You mean Daisy Ridley was involved in another feminist project? Well, that's hardly shocking. Critics who had seen early screenings had published 13 reviews, and 7 of them were negative. This translated into a score of 46% on the all-important aggregation site Rotten Tomatoes. Thus, this was a disappointing outcome for a film with prestige aspirations and no domestic distributor. But just because the tomato meter says a title is rotten, which means it has an aggregated critical score below 60%, it doesn't need to stay that way. So Bunker 15 went to work. While most film PR companies aim to get the attention of critics from top publications, Bunker 15 takes a more bottom-up approach by recruiting obscure, often self-published critics who are nevertheless part of the pool tracked by Rotten Tomatoes. And in another break from standard practice, several critics say that Bunker 15 pays critics $50 or more for each review. Naturally, these payments are not typically disclosed, and Rotten Tomatoes says that it prohibits, quote, reviewing based on a financial incentive, unquote. But how are they going to prevent that from happening? They can't. In October of that year, a Bunker 15 employee emailed a prospective reviewer about Ophelia, writing, quote, "It's a Sundance film, and that feeling is that it's been treated a bit harshly by some critics. I'm sure sky-high expectations were the culprit, so the teams involved feel like it would benefit from more input from different critics," unquote. More input from different critics is not a very subtle code, now is it? And the prospective critic wrote back to ask what would happen if he hated the film. The Bunker 15 employee replied that of course journalists are free to write whatever they like, but that, quote, super nice ones, and there are more critics like this than I expected, unquote, often agreed not to publish bad reviews on their usual websites, but to instead quarantine them on, quote, a smaller blog that Rotten Tomatoes never sees. I think it's a very cool thing to do, unquote. If done right, the trick would help ensure that Rotten Tomatoes only logged positive reviews, but not negative ones. Oh no, we can't have negative movie reviews popping up on a website that's owned by a company that sells movie theater tickets. which itself is partially owned by a Hollywood studio. Between October 2018 and January 2019, Rotten Tomatoes added 8 reviews to Ophelia's score. 7 were favorable, and most came from critics who have reviewed at least one other Bunker 15 movie. The writer of a negative review says that Bunker 15 lobbied them to change it. If the critic wanted to, quote, give it a barely overall positive, then I do know that the editors at Rotten Tomatoes can get it switched, unquote, a Bunker 15 employee wrote. Consequently, Ophelia climbed the tomato meter to 62%, flipping it from rotten to fresh. And gosh golly gee Whittakers, the next month the distributor IFC Films announced that it had acquired Ophelia for release in the US. Gotta keep that money flowing, so you gotta lie about bad movies because apparently these critics who were bought and paid for by Bunker 15 are ethically bankrupt. Ophelia's production company, Covert Media, didn't return requests for comment. Gee, I wonder why. Bunker 15's founder, Daniel Harlow, says, quote, wow, you really are reaching there, unquote, and disagrees with the suggestion that his company buys reviews to skew Rotten Tomatoes, saying, quote, we have thousands of writers in our distribution list. A small handful have set up a specific system where filmmakers can sponsor or pay to have them review a film, unquote. Remember what I said earlier in the video about conflicts of interest and a lack of impartiality? Well, there you go. The Ophelia affair is a useful microcosm for understanding how Rotten Tomatoes, which turned 25 in August, has come to function. The site was conceived in the early days of the web as a hot or not for movies. Now it can make or break them, with implications for how films are perceived, released, marketed, and possibly even greenlit. The tomato meter may be the most important metric in entertainment, yet it's also erratic, reductive, and apparently easily hacked. In other words, you really can't trust Rotten Tomatoes. Filmmaker Paul Schrader said, quote, the studios didn't invent Rotten Tomatoes, and most of them don't like it, but the system is broken. Audiences are dumber. Normal people don't go through reviews like they used to. Rotten Tomatoes is something the studios can game, so they do, unquote. And Rotten Tomatoes is partially owned by Warner Brothers. What can you expect? To filmmakers across the taste spectrum, Rotten Tomatoes is a scourge. Martin Scorsese says it reduces the director, quote, to a content manufacturer and the viewer to an unadventurous consumer, unquote. Brett Ratner has called it, quote, the destruction of our business, unquote. But insiders acknowledge that it has become a crucial arbiter. Publicists say their jobs revolve around the site. One of them said, quote, in the last 10 years, it's become much more important as so many of the most trusted critics have retired without replacements, unquote. An indie distribution executive says, quote, I put in our original business plan that we should not do films that score less than 80. Rotten Tomatoes is the only public stamp of approval that says this is of immense quality and all critics agree, unquote. Is it any wonder why Rotten Tomatoes has been compromised? There's too much money wrapped into it from multiple sides. And that's what it all boils down to, money. But despite Rotten Tomatoes' reputed importance, it's worth a reminder that its math stinks. Scores are calculated by classifying each review as either positive or negative, then dividing the number of positives by the total. That's the whole formula. Every review carries the same weight, whether it runs in a major newspaper or a Substack with a dozen subscribers. If a review straddles positive and negative, too bad. Schrader, who is a former critic, says, quote, I read some reviews of my own films where the writer might say that he doesn't think that I pull something off, but boy, is it interesting in the way that I don't pull it off. To me, that's a good review, but it would count as negative on Rotten Tomatoes, unquote. There's also no accounting for enthusiasm. No attempt to distinguish between extremely and slightly positive or negative reviews. That means a film can score a perfect 100 with just passing grades. A publicist who wished to remain anonymous said, quote, "In the old days, if an independent film got all 3-star reviews, that was like the kiss of death. But with Rotten Tomatoes, if you get all 3-star reviews, it's fantastic," unquote. Another problem, and where the trickery often begins, is that Rotten Tomatoes scores are posted after a movie receives only a handful of reviews, sometimes as few as 5, even if those reviews may be an unrepresentative sample. This is sort of like a cable news network declaring an election night winner after a single county reports its results. But studios see it as a feature, since with a little elbow grease, they can sometimes fool people into believing a movie is better than it is, because it's all about the money. And here's how it works. When a studio is prepping the release of a new title, it will screen the film for critics in advance. It's a film publicist's job to organize these screenings and invite the writers that they think will respond most positively. Then that publicist will set the movie's review embargo in part so that its initial tomato meter score is as high as possible at the moment when it can have maximal benefits for word of mouth and early ticket sales. This is part of the reason why there can be huge discrepancies between the tomato meter and eventual audience scores. Granted, that's not rocket science or even particularly new. But the strategy can be surprisingly effective on tentpole releases, for which studios can leverage the growing universe of fan-run websites, whose critics are generally more admiring of comic book movies than those who write for mainstream outlets. For example, in February, the tomato meter score for Ant-Man and the Wasp: Quantumania debuted at 79% based on its first batch of reviews. Days later, after more critics had weighed in, its rating sank into the 40s, but the gambit may have worked. Quantumania had the best opening weekend of any movie in the Ant-Man series at $106 million, but in its second weekend with its rottenness more firmly established, the film's grosses slid 69%, which was the steepest drop-off in Marvel history. So naturally, this strategy doesn't always work to the studio's advantage, and I had talked about Ant-Man and the Wasp: Quantumania as part of Disney's massive theatrical losses to date for 2023 in my previous video. In a strategic blunder in May, Disney held the first screening of Indiana Jones and the Dildo of Destruction at Cannes, the world's snootiest film festival, which was attended by Kathleen Kennedy and Bob Iger. And it was during Kathleen Kennedy's entry into the festival itself for the screening that Iger had Disney announce the permanent closure of the Star Wars Galactic Starcruiser Hotel, as I had talked about in a video that I had released back in May. And from that premiere at Cannes, the movie received 12 mostly negative reviews, giving the movie an initial score on Rotten Tomatoes of 33%. One of the anonymous publicists who contributed to the article said, quote, "What they should have done was have simultaneous screenings in the States for the critics who might have been more friendly," unquote. But even if that had happened, the movie would still be a massive flop, which is what happened a month and a half later, even though friendly critics eventually lifted its rating to 69%. A third publicist said, quote, "They had a low Rotten Tomatoes score just sitting out there for 6 weeks before release, and that was deadly," unquote. And that brings me to one of my favorite lines in the article. If it sounds like a conflict of interest for a movie review aggregator to be owned by two companies that make movies and another that sells tickets to them, it probably is. This is what I said earlier in the video, and the article itself acknowledges this. And I really like this next line because it is a further admittance from the mass media. Before the acquisition, Fandango had its own 5-star rating scale on its app and website, under which it was almost impossible for a movie to receive fewer than 3 stars. In other words, Fandango had a history of manipulating audience scores even before it came to own Rotten Tomatoes. Since then, even the ostensibly well-intentioned changes it has made to Rotten Tomatoes have seemed to produce score-boosting side effects. Rotten Tomatoes allows users to rate movies alongside critics, and 3 years after the Fandango deal, it changed the way these audience scores were calculated. According to Rotten Tomatoes and the mass media, so-called misogynist trolls had hijacked the platform, coordinating to tank women-led movies like Captain Marvel before they opened. As a quote-unquote fix, for users' reviews to count, they would need to verify that they had bought tickets, which they could do easily by purchasing them via Fandango. Under the new rules, audience scores for tentpole movies have often gotten an early lift since most of the first weekend crowds are diehards who buy tickets in advance. So by making various unproven allegations about trolling, Fandango found an excuse to monetize people's ability to rate films on Rotten Tomatoes to add to Fandango's bottom line. A bigger change came in 2018 when Rotten Tomatoes loosened the restrictions on whose reviews could be indexed. The site had once required its contributors to write for publications with substantial web traffic or print circulations. Now, more freelance and self-publishing critics have been allowed to join along with some who review movies via YouTube or podcasts. Rotten Tomatoes says that more than 1,000 new critics have become quote-unquote Tomatometer approved since 2018, bringing the site's total to about 3,500. They also claim that this has increased representation of those reviewing, but I haven't seen any proof of that. In 2017, a string of bad movies, including Baywatch, which had a Tomatometer score of 17%, and Pirates of the Caribbean, Dead Men Tell No Tales, which had a Tomatometer score of 30%, both flopped in theaters. Studios blamed Rotten Tomatoes, with Deadline reporting, quote, "The critic aggregation site increasingly is slowing down the potential business of popcorn movies. Many of those in the industry severely question how Rotten Tomatoes computes its ratings, and the fact that these scores run on Fandango, which owns Rotten Tomatoes, is an even bigger problem," unquote. Could the allegedly more inclusive Rotten Tomatoes have simply expanded its ranks in hopes that the new critics would be nicer to the IP-driven event movies that Hollywood now mostly depends on? Intentional or not, this appears to be what happened because according to a study by Global News, in 2016, the average Tomatometer score for all wide releases was in the rotten low 50s. But by 2021, that average had climbed to a fresh 60%. Now, whether or not the Tomatometer score on Rotten Tomatoes impacts a movie's box office revenue hasn't actually been proven one way or the other. But one thing is crystal clear. Hollywood studios are attempting to hedge their bets by obtaining positive reviews from critics on the website. And it's also entirely possible that they are sometimes paying Rotten Tomatoes to manipulate audience scores to be in favor of specific movies. Now, while there is no direct evidence to support that claim, large differences in overall audience scores between Rotten Tomatoes, IMDb, and Metacritic provide circumstantial evidence, as I have mentioned in various videos that I have posted in the past. The fact that at least one company has paid critics to write positive reviews so that they'll be aggregated on Rotten Tomatoes and encourage them to only post negative reviews on sites that won't be picked up by Rotten Tomatoes means that other companies have likely done the same thing. If Hollywood studios believe that manipulating reviews and audience scores will help their profitability, it would be foolish to not believe that that's exactly what they are doing, especially since there are no laws to prevent it. Thanks for watching today, and a huge thanks to everyone who has subscribed to our channel. We appreciate your support. If you enjoyed this video, please press the like button, and please feel free to share a comment. If you'd like to help support this channel, please press the red subscribe button, and please press the bell to receive notifications for new content. You can also find us on Facebook, Instagram, Threads, and Twitter by clicking on the links in the description. Until next time, this is Out Loud Geek.